Before we begin, just take a moment to your safe here. There's nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to go, just let your body relax, let your thoughts slow down, and if you enjoy these quiet stories, you can gently support the channel with a like. It helps more than you think now, just let go and allow the story to carry you whenever you're ready, just listen. Fake memories and the Mandela Effect. Who is changing our past? Why do so many people remember the same thing incorrectly? Part 1 of the day the past began to flicker, there are some horrors that come from the future, and there are others that come from the past. Not the past as it really happened. The past as it begins to bend inside the mind. Because memory does not fail like a machine fails. It does not always shatter, go blank, or collapse into darkness. Sometimes it does something much more frightening. It rewrites quietly. It edits with confidence. It gives you the feeling of certainty without giving you the truth. That is where the Mandela Effect begins. Not with science fiction. Not with parallel universes. Not with some hidden hand reaching into history and moving the furniture around. It begins with a simpler and more unsettling event, a group of people discovering that they share the same memory, feel equally sure of it, and are equally wrong. The term Mandela Effect was popularized by Fiona Broome after she and others vividly but falsely remembered Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s, even though Mandela was released in 1990 and died in 2013. The power of the label came from exactly that shock. Not one person misremembering, but many people arriving at the same false past together. That is why the phenomenon feels so sinister. If I remember something incorrectly, that is embarrassing. If we all remember it incorrectly, that feels like sabotage. The mind immediately reaches for a dramatic explanation. Maybe the past changed. Maybe reality split. Maybe a timeline shifted. Maybe history itself is unstable. But modern memory science has spent decades building a colder answer. Memory is not a video recording stored intact in the brain. It is reconstructive. It is rebuilt during recall from fragments, meaning, inference, expectation, and later information. Elizabeth Loftus's misinformation research became famous precisely because it showed that misleading post-event information can distort what people later remember, sometimes with high confidence. That single fact changes everything. Because once memory becomes reconstruction rather than playback, the Mandela Effect stops looking supernatural and starts looking human. The brain does not simply retrieve the past. It rebuilds it from what seems plausible, familiar, emotionally coherent, and socially reinforced. Reviews of false memory research describe source monitoring failures as a core mechanism. People confuse what they actually perceived with what they imagined, inferred, heard from others, or later encountered in media. In other words, the mind is not only storing experience. It is constantly trying to decide where experience came from. Sometimes it gets that decision wrong, and the worst part is that confidence does not protect you. People often imagine false memory as something hazy, weak, or obviously uncertain. But that is not how it behaves in the lab. In the famous De Schrödinger-McDermott paradigm, participants here will read lists of related words like bed, rest, awake, dream, blanket, and snore, and then later confidently remember the word sleep, even though it was never presented. In the original Rodiger and McDermott study, non-presented low words were falsely recalled at remarkable rates and later recognized with high confidence. The point was devastatingly clear. The brain can create a memory not because it saw the thing, but because the thing fits the meaning of what it saw. This is where memory stops being a filing cabinet and starts behaving like a storyteller. It remembers not only details, but patterns. Not only literal experience, but the shape of experience. Not only the tree, but the forest. That idea sits at the center of fuzzy trace theory, which argues that we store both verbatim traces, exact details, and just traces of the broader meaning. Over time, the precise literal trace fades more easily, while the gist often remains. That is why people can forget the exact wording, spelling, shape, or color of something, yet remain fiercely loyal to the essence they think they remember. It is also why false memories can become so stable. The brain prefers coherent meaning over perfect detail. And now the Mandela Effect starts to make eerie sense. Why do people remember Berenstein instead of Berenstein? Why does the Monopoly man seem like he should have a monocle? Why do people remember Siemens 3PO as entirely gold? Why does Pikachu feel as though it ought to have a black-tipped tail? Because the mind is not only storing images, it is normalizing them. It is bending them toward familiar categories, stronger stereotypes, cleaner iconography, and just. In 2022, researchers tested the visual Mandela Effect directly and found that certain pop culture images reliably elicited the same specific false memories across many people. In that work, participants did not simply make random mistakes. They made shared mistakes such as remembering the Monopoly man with a monocle, and the authors found no clear evidence that these errors were driven by unusual visual attention or simple differences in exposure. That finding is one of the most important in the whole field, because it means collective false memory does not require a conspiracy. It does not even require direct collaboration. Sometimes people remember the same one thing because they have seen similar cultural material, built similar gist-based models, and reconstructed the same image in the same direction. The error is social without being centrally controlled. It emerges from shared culture meeting reconstructive memory. A later discussion of the same phenomenon noted that such false memories often move toward a better or more expected visual form, simplifying, exaggerating, or completing details in ways that feel more right than the original. That is why the Mandela Effect feels so personal. It is not just that memory is wrong. It is wrong in a way that feels designed for you. The false version often looks cleaner, more iconic, more narratively satisfying than the real one. Your mind does not merely lose the past. It improves according to its own private standards of coherence. The result is a memory that feels less like an error than a correction, as the reality itself failed to live up to the form your brain expected it to take. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this: even extraordinary memory does not make you immune. In research on people with highly superior autobiographical memory, individuals who can recall dates and personal life events with astonishing precision still show false memory vulnerabilities. In one misinformation task, they were just as capable as others of forming memory distortions for details they had not actually seen. That finding matters because it destroys a comforting myth. False memories are not only the problem of forgetful or inattentive minds. They are part of how human memory works, even in people whose autobiographical recall seems almost superhuman. So if the question is, who is changing our past, the answer in part 1 is already beginning to emerge. Not one hidden editor. Not one institution. Not one machine. The architecture of memory itself is doing part of the work. It stores fragments, meanings, visual expectations, emotional impressions, and social information. Then, when you ask for the past, it does not always hand you the original document. Sometimes it hands you a reconstruction so elegant, so plausible, and so familiar that you mistake it for truth. And once many people share the same culture, the same symbols, the same brands, the same movies, the same stories, and the same expectations, their errors begin to line up. Not perfectly, not universally, but often enough to feel like haunting. So part 1 ends with the terrifying realization the Mandela Effect does not begin when reality changes. It begins when human memory proves that the past inside a crowd is never as stable as the past on paper. A word omitted from a list becomes unforgettable. A monocle appears where none exists. A brand, a line, a face, a death, a colour, a spelling all begin to drift. And the drift feels deliberate only because the mind is better at creating meaning than it is at preserving detail. Part 2, no one changes the past, but crowds can right access to it if Part 1 belongs to the architecture of memory, Part 2 belongs to contagion. Because the Mandela Effect does not become culturally powerful when one person remembers badly. It becomes powerful when memory starts moving socially. That is the point where a private error becomes a public atmosphere. A person says, "I remember it this way." Another says, "Wait, so do I." A third arrives with confidence. A forum appears. A thread grows. Screenshots circulate. False version gains witnesses. The witnesses become proof for one another, and suddenly the error is no longer just in your head. It has become communal. Psychologists have a name for one part of this process: social contagion of memory. In a classic experiment, participants viewed scenes with another person who later remembered objects that had never actually been there. Those false details then leaked into the participants' own recall. The researchers called this process social contagion because memory errors spread through social influence, much the way infection metaphors suggest, not through a literal pathogen, but through exposure, repetition, and trust. That matters because it helps explain why large groups can end up remembering the same wrong thing. You do not need everyone to make the same error independently. You only need enough people to make it, repeat it, and validate it for others. The memory then stops feeling like reconstruction and starts feeling like consensus. And consensus is seductive. The mind treats agreement as a kind of evidence. If enough other people report the same remembered detail, source monitoring becomes harder. Did I really see that? Or have I now heard it often enough that it feels self-generated? Research on source monitoring failures describes exactly this kind of confusion between lived experience and socially supplied content. The internet has made this process vastly more powerful, not because it invented false memory, because it industrialized reinforcement. A rumor that once might have stayed inside one school, family, or friend group can now circulate through millions of people, be repeated across memes and videos, be framed as discovery rather than error, and be encountered from multiple apparent sources. Neuroexperimental work shows that repetition of misinformation increases its influence, and that source variability, hearing the same misinformation from more than one source, it can matter to. In practical terms, the digital world does exactly what false memory thrives on. It repeats, varies, normalizes, and socializes uncertain material until familiarity itself begins to mask or aid as proof. This is one reason the Mandela Effect feels more common now than it may actually be. The internet does not just reveal shared misremembering. It teaches people how to notice, label, and rehearse it. Once a wrong memory becomes a meme, it gets rehearsed more often than the correct version. People discuss it, compare it, joke about it, defend it, and imagine the scene vividly. And vivid imagination matters. Research on false memory formation has repeatedly found that elaboration, repeated reflection, and conceptual processing can strengthen false recollection. A memory does not have to be true to feel richer after you revisit it. In fact, revisiting it may help make it feel truer. So when people ask, why do so many of us remember the same thing incorrectly, the answer is not merely that memory is weak. It is that memory is collaborative, sometimes explicitly through conversation, sometimes implicitly through culture, sometimes algorithmically through repeated online exposure. The crowd does not only influence what we believe about the present, it can alter what the past feels like when we retrieve it. And that is where the Mandela Effect becomes more than a curiosity. It becomes a warning about how fragile collective memory really is. False memory researchers have shown that exposure to misleading information can alter later recall, that social influence can implant seen details, and that even subtle warnings are sometimes necessary to reduce misinformation effects. Once memory is understood as reconstructive and socially permeable, the past stops being a fixed internal possession and starts looking more like a negotiated mental artifact. There is another layer too, and it may be the most unsettling of all. The crowd is not always random in what it gets wrong. 2022 work on the visual Mandela Effect found that people often converge on the same specific false version of an icon, not just on generic uncertainty. That means collective false memory is not pure noise. It has direction. Certain distortions are more attractive than others. Certain errors fit our expectations, visual schemas, or cultural stereotypes better. We are not all remembering randomly. We are being pulled toward the same plausible wrong answers. That should trouble anyone who thinks of memory as a private archive, because now the mind looks less like a vault and more like a predictive engine. It does not merely preserve what was there. It fills gaps with what should have been there. It rounds rough edges. It intensifies iconic traits. It completes the image according to statistical expectation. When many people share the same cultural training, their memory errors become correlated. The same meaning produces the same distortion. And that is how the Mandela Effect acquires its eerie force. Not because millions are literally slipping between universes, because millions are running similar cognitive software in similar cultural conditions. The result can feel paranormal from the inside because the subjective experience is so convincing. You are not guessing. You are remembering. Or rather, you are having the experience of remembering, which is not always the same thing. False memory research has shown again and again that people can report vivid, confident, or collective experiences for things that never happened or never appeared in the form they remember. The trouble is not that memory sometimes invents. It is that invention can arrive with the emotional texture of certainty. This is also why arguments about the Mandela Effect so often become heated. Because people are not defending a trivia answer. They are defending trust in their own mind. If I have to admit that I remember the Monopoly man's monocle, a line from a film, a logo, a book title, or a historical event incorrectly, then I am not simply wrong about a detail. I am wrong about the reliability of my own inner witness. And for many people, that feels like a deeper injury than ordinary factual correction. So the question in the title, who is changing our past? It deserves an honest answer. Usually no one is changing the past, but many things can change our access to it. Misinformation can. Social influence can. Repetition can. Source confusion can. Meaning-based reconstruction can. Internet culture can. Shared iconography can. And once enough of these forces overlap, the false version may begin to feel not only plausible, but inevitable. That answer is less exciting than parallel realities, and much more dangerous. Because if the Mandela Effect were really caused by cosmic timeline shifts, there would be almost nothing to learn from it. It would simply be a bizarre fact of the universe, that if it is caused by reconstructive memory, social contagion, and repeated misinformation, then it reveals something urgent about modern life. Large groups can become synchronized around false recollections without any single mastermind needing to fabricate the entire illusion. The system can do it on its own. Culture can do it on its own. Networks can do it on their own. No puppet master required. And that means the Mandela Effect is not merely a fun internet oddity. It is a miniature model of something much larger. How reality becomes socially unstable when memory, confidence, and repetition begin reinforcing one another. The same mechanisms that make people misremember a logo or a line can, under more serious conditions, affect eyewitness testimony, historical belief, political memory, and public judgment. Memory scientists have been worried about this for decades, which is why false memory research has always had implications far beyond laboratory puzzles. And yet there is one final twist. The Mandela Effect does not only reveal weakness, it reveals design trade-offs. A mind that stores gist, not just detail, is often useful. It helps us generalize, infer, categorize, and move through the world efficiently. The same systems that permit false memory also support abstraction and meaning. Fuzzy trace theory emphasizes exactly this paradox. Gist-based processing can improve judgment in many settings, even while making certain false memories more likely. In other words, the brain's vulnerability to Mandela-style errors may not be a defect bolted onto an otherwise perfect system. It may be part of the cost of having a mind built for meaning rather than literal replay. That makes the phenomenon almost tragic. The very thing that lets us build stories, symbols, categories, and culture also lets us misremember them together. So the story ends where it has to end, not with the villain in a hidden room moving facts around, but with the crowd staring at the same image, recalling the same wrong version, and mistaking agreement for proof. A false death. A monocle that was never there. A black tail that feels right. A word omitted from a list but remembered anyway. A detail offered by another person and slowly adopted as your own. 1,000 repetitions online until the wrong past begins to feel warmer than the documented one. That is the real horror of fake memories and the Mandela Effect. No one has to change history. Human minds, networked together, can do something almost as powerful. It can make a different version of history feel personally remembered. And once that happens, the hardest thing in the world is not proving what is true. It is convincing people that the deepest voice inside them, the one saying "I remember," is sometimes the least trustworthy witness in the room.